Hello and welcome to this IIEA webinar. This webinar, I'm Matt O'Neill. I'm the climate project lead here at the IIEA, and this webinar forms part of our Pathways research, looking at Ireland's agricultural future. I just wanted to come on and say we're very grateful for our participants today in giving up their time and offering their views on a really interesting topic. And just to say that anybody is always willing and able to reach out to me at the IIEA if they wish to talk about any further points or introduce any new ideas. We're very open to this conversation on what is Ireland's agricultural future. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our chair today and to say another big thank you for her giving up her time to Niamh Garvey. So I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Matt. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar titled Denmark's Green Tripartite Agreement, a new model for Ireland's agriculture and climate policy. So thank you all for joining us this morning. I'm Niamh Garvey. I'll be chairing today, as Matt mentioned. And to those of you who don't know me, I'm a senior policy analyst with the National Economic and Social Council, and I work in areas related to sustainable development and climate action. So today's session, we're going to be looking at how Denmark took a major step with its 2024 Green Tripartite Agreement, which was very much the first of its kind to introduce an agricultural climate tax as part of a broader package of reform around emissions, nature, and nutrient pollution. So we really hope today to gain an understanding not only of what Denmark agreed, but how and why, and also to maybe reflect on some lessons that Ireland might be able to learn from this process. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping issues. Our panel will present for around 40 minutes. The Danish perspective will take about 30 minutes between the two presenters, and then we'll have some reflection from two Irish panelists, which will last about 20 minutes. I'm then going to ask a couple of questions, and after that we'll turn to the audience for your questions and your insights. So please do make use of the Q&A function during the session and after the presentations to get your questions in. We'll be keeping an eye on them and we'll be able to read them out to the panel for response. Please do remember to identify yourself and any affiliation when you're asking a question. And finally, just a reminder that today's presentation and the Q&A session are going to be on record. I'm going to hand over to the panel shortly now, but I'm just going to introduce all four of them first, and then we'll hand over. So Johannes Flatz is climate analyst in CONCITO's programme on food and consumption. Johannes works as climate analyst with a focus on analysis of European agricultural policies. He's particularly focused on the analysis of the Common Agricultural Policy and the regulation of carbon emissions from the agricultural sector. He has a master's degree in environmental economics from the University of Copenhagen. Erik Jørgensen is chief consultant at the Climate and Energy Danish Agriculture and Food Council. Erik was very involved in the tripartite process, so we're really keen to get his perspectives on that. And Erik mainly focuses on EU policies. Maria Snell then is senior policy executive at Feirme, Ireland's national organisation representing young farmers and rural youth. She holds a PhD in environmental science from the UK, where she worked on projects on water quality, habitat management and ecological health. Maria returned home to join Macra, where she works to ensure that the voices of rural youth are represented in shaping sustainable agricultural, rural development and environmental policy. And our final panellist is Ailbhe Gerrard. Ailbhe is a farmer, beekeeper and agricultural educator and the founder of Brookfield Farm in County Tipperary. She's also a leading member of Talamh, the Irish branch of La Via Campesina, and has been recognised for her innovative agroecological farming practices and advocacy for community-led food systems. So we have a fantastic panel, really looking forward to the discussion. And I'll hand over now to Johannes. Please begin your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. And thank you also to Matt and the IIEA team for organizing this really interesting webinar and inviting me. I'm going to share my screen and I'll ask the question, can everybody see my screen, and hopefully also in presenting mode? That works. Right. So yeah, a Danish perspective. I'm going to talk a little bit about why Denmark is introducing, as the first country in the world, a tax on agricultural emissions, and how Denmark is now pushing that idea, not just in Denmark itself, but also abroad in the EU. And I'm going to start with a little bit of background information. Let me start by the most simple thing. Denmark's emissions between 1990 and 2024 And you can see here that Danish emissions have dropped significantly since the 90s. And the reductions were mostly coming from the electricity sector, but also industry. And you can see that in the same time frame, agriculture, you can see in blue in the bottom, has barely reduced its emissions in this time. So you can see that energy has been very good at reducing its emissions in Denmark. Agriculture hasn't really, and that also played quite a large role in why the Danish government has decided and also been pushed to put further regulation on the agricultural sector. You can also see that there has been a lot of structural development in Danish agriculture in the past 30 years. You can see that there's a lot less full-time agricultural businesses, so a lot less farmers today than there were in 1990. But the average farm size has been growing very rapidly. So farmers today are a lot larger than they used to, and they're a lot more specialized and also a lot more industrialized. At the same time, you can see that the share of total employment of agriculture in the Danish economy has dropped significantly. So has the share of total added value. So while emissions from agriculture has largely remained the same since the 90s, its share in the Danish economy has dropped. And just to talk a little bit about what the agricultural sector in Denmark today looks like and where its emissions are coming from, you can see here that more than half of the emissions in Danish agriculture is coming from livestock. So mostly from cattle, but also from pig production. And then there's also a large emission source in organic soils. So I think in this regard, Danish agricultural emissions are quite similar to Irish ones. And you can also see the small tree on the top right. That's the forest sink that we have in Denmark, and it's really very small. There's really not a lot of natural land in Denmark today that is a functioning carbon sink. So we can see there's a lot to do in Danish agriculture and a lot of focus points, mostly livestock, organic soils, and forestry. So, final background slides. The Danish climate law is very important for the Green Tripartite. That was agreed upon in 2020 in the parliament, with 90% of parties agreeing on this climate law, which means that there was not only the governing parties, but also a lot of the opposition parties, which would mean that if there is a change in government, the climate law is likely going to hold because so many parties have agreed on it in the past. And they also agreed on a binding target for agriculture by 2030 of about 55 to 65% reduction. And that is because without any action, agriculture would be the largest emission sector in Denmark by 2030. Not just the largest, but also larger than all the other sectors combined. And because of that, there was a lot of pressure from energy saying to the Danish government, hey, we have been quite good at reducing our emissions. You've put a lot of regulation on us. Now, there's another sector overtaking us as the biggest emission source. So you have to do something about this, otherwise that would not be fair. So that's the background to the climate law. The government put in an expert group to find a way on how to reduce emissions. They come up with different methods, mostly focused on a tax system. There was a very big report also coming out in English called the Svare report. If you're really interested in how to design a tax in agriculture, I can only recommend this 400-page report. It's a very good read. And now the Green Tripartite. So after the expert group made their recommendation in the late 2023, there was a tripartite set in with different negotiating partners. Here we have the Danish Agriculture and Food Council, who is also represented today by Erik in the presentation later. Also the Danish Society for Nature Conservation, the Confederation of Danish Industry, who, as I said, already put a lot of pressure on the agricultural sector to reduce emissions just as well. Labor unions have been a part here as well. And then, of course, the Danish government and the Danish local governments. And my organization, CONCITO, we have been not a negotiating partner in these negotiations, but we were a knowledge partner, providing a lot of inputs to the other partners. So what was agreed upon after about half a year of negotiations in June last year, the government and the parties in the tripartite agreed on a new green agreement for Denmark, which now had some key elements, a 70% reduction target for agricultural emissions by 2030. So quite an increase of the original climate law. And in order to reach that, the parties agreed on a tax on greenhouse gas emission from livestock only here, with a 40 euro tax by 2030, and which is increasing to 100 euros by 2035. There will be a base deduction of about 60%, but I think Erik is going to explain a bit more on that later in his presentation, how that's going to work. There's also subsidies for reducing fertilizer use, about 100 euro per ton by 2035, by 2028. Then there's going to be a tax on drains and peatlands, about 5 euros per ton by 2028 as well. Idea here is to incentivize farmers to take out their drain peatlands from production. And then finally, there's a 1.3 billion euro fund for biochar subsidies, so research and building up industry capacity for the application of biochar. And that fund is aimed towards 2045. And then there has been a second very big part of that agreement, and that is establishing a 5 billion euro green land fund, which has the aim of reforesting about 250,000 hectares, which is corresponding to 6% of Danish territory, which is virtually doubling the forest land that we have today, natural forest land. Another goal is also to re-wet 140,000 hectares of carbon-rich drained peatlands, and 1.4 billion euros of this 5 billion euro fund is allocated to nitrogen-reducing efforts with the hope that we can reduce or improve the water quality of Danish waters. And now the results of that is hopefully a reduction of 1.8 million tons by 2030 and maybe up to 3.6 million tons of CO2 by 2035. With that comes a 4% production decline in agriculture. So the Danish government is not saying, hey, we are doing this tax in a way that it will not affect production at all. They are calculating with an approximate 4% production decline. But importantly, only a 1% price increase for Danish customers is estimated here. So the impacts on food prices are likely not very high. But with all these efforts, we are going to reach Denmark's 2030 climate targets. We are going to reach the European LULUCF targets. And we're also reaching the EU's effort sharing regulation with the regulation that's going to be put in place. So a question that has often come up is why are we taxing production of livestock and not consumption of meat and dairy products? And there have been some calculations that show that a 100 euro tax on production would give us in Denmark a reduction of 2.8 million tons of CO2, while a tax on consumption would only give 0.2% million tons of CO2 in Denmark. And that is mostly because Danish agriculture is very export-oriented, especially in the livestock sector. About 80% of livestock goods produced in Denmark are being exported. So that means that if we want to tax consumption, the tax would have to be 5 times as high to reach the same reductions than a tax on production in agriculture, because so much is being exported, and that you could just not tax with a consumption tax. And also a very important part is that there needs to be a price incentive on the individual farmer, which you also would not have with a consumption tax, because a farmer that has been doing a lot to improve the climate footprint of his meat and dairy products would have the same tax in the supermarkets than the farmer that has not been doing as much to reduce the climate footprint. So a production tax can be differentiated, and that's super important in order to incentivize farmers to do the right thing. Well, what now? There's a continuing process in Denmark. Not only the tax has to be implemented, the land funds has to be allocated. There's currently a lot of negotiations, especially in local tripartites and local governments, negotiating how to allocate the 5 billion euros. But the Danish government also had a mandate in the agreement that it has to push for a similar solution on an EU level. And currently, the Danish government holds the presidency of the EU Council, and with that can push a lot of these points on the agenda. And they are pushing emissions pricing in agriculture. There are conferences organized in Brussels, Copenhagen. Just a couple of weeks ago, All the agriculture ministers in Europe have been invited to Denmark in order to hear a lot about the Green Tripartite. And of course, there's a big concern for Danish farmers, and that's the problem of carbon leakage. That if production is affected here in Denmark, the possibility that production moves just to another EU country because of the free market, that's of course a big concern for Danish farmers. So the idea here is to create a level playing field that that emissions are priced all over the EU, and then you can ensure that carbon leakage within EU countries would be eliminated. And it's a lot easier to ensure carbon leakage outside of free markets to prevent that by a carbon tariff, something that already exists. It's called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism for industry emission pricing. So that's something that's a lot easier to do on an EU level than on a national level. So the government is trying to push for something that's resembling the Danish tax model as closely as possible. Taxes on an EU level are very difficult to implement because all EU countries would have to agree on that. It's not just a majority question. So the EU is doing something similar called an ETS, emission trading system, that already exists for industry and energy. And that's something that's possibly also being implemented for agriculture. At least that's something that the Danish government is pushing, the EU Commission is looking into, and my organization, CONCITO, we are also working actively on that topic. So the EU Commission is actually looking into this right now. There's a big report coming by the EU Commission in November on how emissions from agriculture could be tackled. And they're exploring 3 different options. The first is a mandatory climate standard, where food processors, so meat and dairy processors, would have to have standards to reduce their emissions. Another option is the public procurement of carbon farming credits. So here, credits by farmers could be generated if they implement better manure management, feed additives to their food, to their feed for cows. And by reducing the emissions in this technical way, they can create credits that then can be sold either to the downstream food and meat and dairy processors, or by the Commission public procurement buying up these credits. We at CONCITO are actually very critical of that idea because it's very much based on voluntarily, and with that might not be as effective in incentivizing the necessary reductions in emissions that we need. So we are recommending Ag ETS, an agri-food emissions trading system, where either downstream processors pay for the emissions of the meat and dairy that they're buying from farmers, or farmers themselves are trading for emission credits for emission reductions. If you're more interested in that topic, I'll not go into much more detail, but CONCITO has published a big report called Climate Action in the Downstream Agriculture Emissions Trading, where we're exploring all of these options in more detail. But regardless of an ETS or a tax, there are some things that we think are super important, not just in Denmark, but also in the EU, that we think should be applied. And that's ETS, but the tax, they can both be a very effective tool to address emissions from the livestock sector. So emissions pricing is effective to reduce emissions. But it's very important that we are ensuring clear incentives on farm to enable on-farm climate action and incentivize farmers to do the right thing. We need good monitoring, reporting, and verification. That's the key to any good climate policy. But we also think that the design of an MRV approach can be simple and can build on existing data and default values. That's something that we are doing in Denmark, and that's something that can be done on a European level. It is not impossible, but it's very important that that design fits with national inventories to make emission reductions count. And final point, revenues that carbon pricing policies are generating. Tax emission trading system is generating revenues, can amplify the overall climate action and address other concerns such as distributional impacts. And that's something that we're going to do in Denmark. We said that all the revenues that the climate tax is generating will be reallocated to the agricultural sector to help farmers to transition and to ensure that we'll have a fair transition to a more greener agricultural sector. And with that, I'm gonna end my presentation and hand it over to the next presenter. If you have any questions, you're more than welcome to follow up, but thank you very much.
Thank you. We invite Erik to give his presentation. And just a reminder, if you are asking, please do put your questions in the Q&A and state your name and affiliation. Thank you, Erik.
Thank you so much. I hope you all can hear me. I just have to put this into viewing mode. Just a second. I don't know how it looks in your place. Is it okay, the slides?
And we can see the slides. It is. We can see the presenter mode. Okay. So yeah, that's better. Yeah.
Okay, that's perfect. Okay, thank you so much for having me at this webinar. I am pleased to be here, as Johannes was before, and I was asked to elaborate a bit more on our background, our thoughts about joining this this agreement, these negotiations, and so on. I will start with doing that, and then later on I will dig a bit more into some of the results Johannes already presented for you, and have our considerations, our wishes for how this is going to be implemented. But first and foremost, I would say we were and are standing on a burning platform, seen from on a global perspective, but from the agriculture as well. Johannes already told that there's a majority, a vast majority of the Danish Parliament, they were in favor of a climate tax. It was unavoidable. It was coming no matter what. There was a lot of pressure from other industries on agriculture to deliver. Johannes, he showed the first figure, I guess, showing that the reductions in the agricultural sectors, they were very small in the later years, the last 10 years, nothing has happened. And on top of that, there has been a lot of pressure on agriculture in Denmark, there still are, regarding other issues such as environmental issues and the impact on of food production. As you know, and we have a very intensive agricultural production. We occupy around 2/3 of all the land in Denmark. It is cultivated. So of course, we have a major impact on our environment. So that's kind of the background, that's the burning platform. Then moving on to our motivation for joining the negotiations. As we see it, it was our best option for a unified policy for Danish agriculture and food. And as I already mentioned, we had the government, they had promised a carbon tax on agriculture. So there was no way to avoid it anyway. But we couldn't suggest any alternatives, even though I have to say that the carbon tax itself, it's not our first choice of action, not our second choice, not our third choice. We had, I think, better solutions, but we were going to face a carbon tax anyway, so we might as well join. And you can say that the alternative to participating was stand outside the room and have no influence. We could face tougher regulation with the less flexibility if we didn't try to put forward our concerns. And it wouldn't stop the fragmented debate about the agricultural profession. I'm not sure that will stop by this agreement anyway, but it might help. And it's very important that the agreement is based on multiple challenges are solved or addressed. That could help having a less fragmented debate in the future. So you could ask yourself why it worked, and I think first and foremost was we were collaborating. All relevant parties, they were put together and asked to find a solution. And very importantly, there were a clear framework. There was some you could say rules, borders you had to negotiate within. So everybody had to make a compromise. Agriculture couldn't get it as we wanted. The Green organization could not have their wish list fulfilled, and so on. So we all had to make compromise, and I think that's very important. Otherwise, it wouldn't be real negotiations. It would just be the standard talk. And then, of course, and in connection with that, the inclusion of the sector and all other relevant sectors, organizations was very important. So we could have some ownership in the solutions instead of just seeing them being dragged over our heads. And then I mentioned it already a bit, the holistic approach. It was really a turn on in this process. We could include other relevant issues that had to be solved or addressed, biodiversity, environment, and so on. And I think that was what really made it happen. And of course, that came with a lot of investments, public money, and that's perhaps not to be copied in all countries. But that was really important as well. And then for the agriculture, it was very important to have an assurance that we, in the future, would have a continuation of a strong agricultural sector in Denmark. Johannes showed a minor decrease in production that is foreseen, but I mean, it's not like we hear from the Netherlands, where they are cutting or planning to cut very deep in some of the production. We could face a future for agriculture, and that was a very important assurance for us. Now I will dig into some of the results that Johannes already showed and try to put on our perspective on them. This is just the basic numbers. As you've seen, it's a lot of land that has to have a land use change. Some almost 400,000 hectares. That's more than 15% of the agricultural land today. So that's a vast amount. And then the carbon tax, I'll dig into that, but it starts with a marginal rate of 40 euros, and in 10 years' time, we'll have 100 euros of tax. Some very important preconditions for us was that the tax is introduced gradually over a 5 years period. It'll give even more time to adjust, to make investments in reduction technologies. The main driver for us is not that a tax is coming and we have to pay a tax. We will rather not pay the tax, invest in the reductions instead. That would be better for our profession, but it would surely be better for the climate as well, because tax to the state will not help the climate. And then a very, very important factor for us is the base deduction, because the base deduction, it addresses the fact that agriculture is not like other industry where you can turn from coal, oil to electricity. To say it in a perhaps stupid way, you can't electrify a cow or pig. So it's biological processes, and you'll never reach zero, no matter what you do. If you turn into 100% plant production, there will still be emissions from cultivation. So a base deduction is very important. And then several important factors were taken into account. Only tax on emission from pig and cattle. They are the big emitters from Danish agriculture. And on top of that, there will be a de minimis threshold for herd size. That means that smaller farmers, they should not be included. It will be too costly. It will be too much bureaucracy for them. So that's good for us as well. And then there will be a differentiation between animal types and production types. And what we're hearing now is that they are working on around 20 different groups. So all farm types will not be treated equally. This may change. I think the tax system is still under development, but it'll be a lot of differentiation. And then the stable type feeding strategy will be included. And as Johannes already mentioned, the revenues from the tax will be reinvested in the sector. So we'll have even more reductions. That's good. This figure is perhaps not the most clear one to look at, but it tries to describe the principles of the base deduction. In this example, there's a 5 tons emission today, and what we are trying to reach is a 3 tons emission. The base deduction, sorry, we need to reduce by 2 tons and reach, a 3 tons emission when the tax is implemented. The figures tends to show how to deal with it. You can either pay the tax for the 2 tons, or you can invest in different measures. And in these figures, we are trying to show that digestion might take a big portion. You can do something in the stable, and you can change your things in your manure storage. And by doing that, you might be able to reach the target and avoid the tax. And that's the whole point. Investments in reductions are better than paying the tax, in our view. I've mentioned technologies before, and in a very intensively driven agricultural system, as we have in Denmark, technologies is a vital instrument, or more instruments. It might be different in more extensively run agricultures in other countries, but in Denmark, technologies is key. And it was a very important premise for the tripartite. We need a lot of different technologies, as we have different farm types and different production types. And we need them to be tested, validated, and ready to use very quickly, and preferably before 2030. Of course, cost effectiveness is a key factor. If they are too expensive, you should rather pay the tax, which is not a good thing. And then, of course, you have to look into the possible side effects. You need to identify them. It's not a good idea that you reduce the emissions, but then you have you create another problem. And then Johannes mentioned the MRV systems as well. They need to be very efficiently because we need reliable effects. They're vital. We need to have true reductions, and not just on paper. Then here at the end, I'll just mention the tax on peatlands. Johannes mentioned that as well. We have around 70,000 hectares of carbon-rich lowland soils, peatlands, and around them we another 70,000 hectares are bordering them, and they need to be taken out as well, because when you're re-wetting the peatlands, they will be affected as well. That's the prognosis by now, that we need to take out around 140,000 hectares. If you as a farmer have got those peatlands and you say, yes, I want to join a project, you'll avoid the tax. And if you say no, you'll have to pay the tax. So there's kind of a carrot and stick process here. You can avoid them by joining, and you'll get subsidies for taking out your land. So it might be a driver for the farmers. That's what we hope, because there are a lot of emissions from the peatlands. And it's going to be looked into details in 2027. The process on the peatlands is already ongoing now. It started before the tripartite, actually, and so it's an ongoing process. It's not something that is going to be started in the coming years. So we have good experiences so far. Around 50 to 55,000 hectares is already into the system. Some of them might not be turned into projects, but we are quite comfortable. So yeah, that's my first round of introduction, and you are, of course, very welcome to ask any questions later on. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Erik, and thank you, Johannes. That's a fantastic, between the two presentations, a really good overview of the Danish experience there. So we're going to move straight into some reflections from an Irish perspective. I'll invite Maria first, or Ailbhe first, and then Maria for their reflections on the on what they've just heard. Thank you, and please do keep the questions coming in.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much to Matt and the IIEA for the invitation and the opportunity to join to discuss this really interesting proposal and plan from Denmark. I'm speaking on behalf of Talamh, which is an organization of regenerative farmers and looking to support local food, looking to support regenerative agriculture, looking to reduce climate emissions, but also looking for food justice, livelihoods for farmers, and a whole range of positive things for farmers and food producers. I'm also a farmer with a diverse, organically certified farm, which gives certain other insights. So having read through the Danish Tripartite, having listened to the two excellent presentations today, I think that there are huge opportunities here for Ireland. But what we need to do is to be really aware of the importance of the three elements that really stand out to me, of the holistic thinking, which is that there's agreement on what the problems are. Ireland is facing into large taxes for breaching our emissions for greenhouse gases. So we might as well put the money into helping solve the problem rather than just paying the fine and carrying on as we're going. The other really important thing is the collaboration, and that the Irish agriculture and food producing sector needs to really pull together in a way that the Danish model shows us can be done. And they also to support the existing agriculture system to assist with transition, if this is what if this is the way that Ireland would be going, is to support the export agriculture system as we currently have with export of meat and milk, to support that that the assurance that that's going to be able to continue, but possibly in a more appropriate way. That would be the initial considerations on that. The other really important thing is that this is potentially a huge opportunity for Irish agriculture. We do know that we have major problems with Irish farm livelihoods, the cost of inputs going up, the lack of young farmers wanting to enter, take over their parents' farms, and also not a huge number of new entrants because of the barriers to entry to farming. And I think a plan a little like the Danish Tripartite plan could help solve some of these problems. Another really important part is looking at the food system as a whole. The Talamh have written a local food policy framework, which really integrates food production and getting food through the production system and to consumer. But also that gives us an opportunity to rethink how in the Irish context, that we are producing food, but also running it through the system to get to the consumer. There's a huge opportunity here for the profits that are in the middle with processing and retailing, to redistribute some of that money to the primary producers, to the farmers, and also to consumers, giving us an opportunity for more locally produced healthy food. Because as we know at the moment, we're exporting 90% of our meat and milk, but we're importing the vast majority, 90% I think it is, of our fruit and vegetables. That kind of thing could be, we have an opportunity to change that whole system of how we're exporting calorie heavy food, but also importing the important food as well. So I think it's a really interesting possibility to sit down and with all the parties involved and look at. And one thing that I'm really impressed by the Danes, and also with their organic agriculture plan, which looks not just at production, but also runs right through to public food, with a proportion of required organic food in all public kitchens, for instance, is that it's been thought through really carefully. And that comes from it's a very measured approach. I think we could learn a lot from that as well in Ireland. That it's very much more about the greater good, and ultimately sort of the greater good of society and health of society, rather than us in our silos thinking about our own interests and what's really important for our own particular sector. We need to step on that if we're going to deal with the really serious concerns that we have as farmers, particularly as I'm very aware that we do have we have a changing climate, we have more uncertain weather patterns, and we do need to change our agriculture to take that into account. And this gives us an opportunity to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Ailbhe. And Maria, over to you for the final of our panelist inputs. Thank you.
Thank you, Niamh. And thank you very much to Erik and Johannes for a very informative presentation. I would agree that certainly this is a milestone in terms of climate, environmental and agricultural policy. And I might just pick up on some of the points that Ailbhe made around young farmers and succession generation renewal. So I would agree that while there's lots to learn from the Danish model and and their approach, I would say that it's important also that we recognise that Ireland's farming system is fundamentally different in terms of the size and structure, and also I suppose our natural resource, and the variability in climate and soil across our island, and that we are an island. And I suppose the model itself is based really on the family farm, which we're very proud of and something that we really want to protect going forward. Because without that model, we don't have succession, we don't have family farming. And, I think this is an important part of environmental care and environmental protection. We have very strong proven links between, farming, their communities and environmental management. And it's really to look at that and build on the initiatives that are already there. I think sometimes when we look to an inspirational piece of legislation that's doing something radically different, or leading the way, we forget that actually we're also doing a lot of work day to day on farms as well, and that farmers are actively engaged in this all the time. And we've many strong initiatives and frameworks here that reflect this commitment to the environment. I think the one thing that we can all agree on, and Erik, talked about it, the thing of finding kind of the common ground that we all want to protect our environment and have a better environment for the next generation to come. And we have lots of different, between schemes, knowledge exchange program, advisory, that promote, I suppose, critically sustainability, but also the viability of family farms and farms in general. And while that should be acknowledged, that there is lots that we can do and lots that we can build on, and lots of, I suppose, principles and inspiration that we can take from different models elsewhere, and in particular the Danish model that we've just heard about this morning. I suppose one of the key things that strikes me, was the comments around, kind of a comprehensive, holistic model, and I think that is important. I understand that this started out really looking at emissions, and then it brought in other elements such as, water quality, the Water Framework Directive, and targets that, that we're struggling to meet right across Europe. And certainly, I think to bring everything together into a long-term kind of holistic framework is beneficial, because there's a lot of different elements in terms of the environmental policy that farmers are working with day on day, be that water, environment, biodiversity, and initiatives. So I think it's important, to have this kind of predictable long-term frameworks, because certainly in the Irish context, a key challenge is that we have a very kind of short-term policy cycles, and that creates uncertainty, and it makes it really difficult, particularly from a young farmer point of view, but also farming in general, to make kind of plans to put together investments, because it's just very hard to plan against all that kind of short-term policy uncertainty. and to make investment for nature, but also for your farm business. And I think, a thing that also strikes me about this agreement is that it kind of lays out a roadmap, and it gives time to go on a journey together. And we recognize that there's still a lot of work to do in certain areas to work the detail out, but it sets a path, and you critically have those lead-in times. And I think that's something that we could learn from here, to have that time to plan, prepare, and finding the right structure and financial support. And I suppose the other element that really struck me as well was the collaborative approach, and this concept of finding the compromise through kind of structured collaboration and dialogue. And I think those are really important. I mean, as you know, I understand that there was 7 parties undertook that kind of structured dialogue in terms of the Danish agreement. But I suppose if you look at Irish agriculture, it's structured a little bit differently. And so I would say that there would need to be more parties at the table, which brings more challenges, but also opportunities. But it's important that everybody is at that table recognising our family farm model, the differences across sectors, and that we have this kind of wider shared ownership, and coming back also to ownership by rural communities as well, of which farmers are an integral part of. So I think that's really important, that kind of, I suppose, giving assurances to farmers, but also bringing everybody on the journey and finding that compromise to be able to find that common ground to move forward from. And I suppose just another point that Ailbhe touched on was the opportunities that lie within this model too. And I suppose some of the things that struck me in particular was, the investment into research, and as young farmers, we very much take a science-driven approach, that we like an evidence base to help us make informed decisions. And I suppose, what in this, we have a kind of a strong structure of measures, both some existing and new proposed measures. And it's great that there is ongoing research going into this. What I would say is that's really important, that that we have the research, but also that this is implementable and it's practical actions at farm scale. Sometimes there can be a disconnect here, that farmers and young farmers would experience. So it's important as we move through this process, and if we were to take some inspiration from this, to really look at that element of it, that make sure that it's always practical at farm scale and there's actionable steps there. Another thing that struck me was the use of technology, which is fantastic, and but I would urge that that's not a replacement, but a driver for the social element. And in all of these discussions, when we talk about sustainability, I feel like we're missing out on the social element, and I think it's particularly stark, but it's also statistics that reflect across Europe, is that we have really a crisis in generation renewal. Only 4.3% approximately of farmers under 35 here in Ireland, but yet we know that technology alone is not going to deliver the change that we need. It's not going to help us bring down our emissions. It's not going to help us in terms of delivering back biodiversity. That we need people here as well, alongside these other tools in that we're developing and have at the moment. So I think it's really important that we start to look at the social element and how we can support farmers, how we can look at some of these barriers, because if we really want sustainability in the holistic sense, we need to look at not just the environment and the financial stability of a business, but also to look at that social element as well. And we really need our young people. And I suppose this is very much to the fore of my mind. Yesterday we had the EU strategy on generation renewal was published, and I suppose we can see that the role the policy has, and that CAP is referred to within the tripartite agreement and the opportunities there. And I would say, as we go forward, it's really important that we do have a ring-fence budget for young farmers, so that we can help us. I suppose that we all have a willingness to take part and to do our part, but that we need that support, that we can't do it alone, and that we have significant barriers in terms of access to land and finance, and particularly in the Irish model. Like, we do have challenges in different sectors around poor profitability or variable profitability. It just depends on the markets in the year, and so therefore there can be limited investment capacity. there's a lot of requirements, not just in the environmental space, not just in emissions, but also in water, so on. And sometimes, these as these technologies are emerging, for example, feed additives, they can be very costly and may not necessarily drive down production, help production efficiencies, but increase costs. So we need to kind of look and make sure that we have kind of the right kind of investment supports there, and capacity for farmers to move and take the necessary actions. And I suppose all of this, helps to increase the attractiveness. The more supports and the more coherent and collaborative approaches, when we feel like we're all on a journey together and that no one has been left behind, it does increase the attractiveness of the agricultural sector as a whole. It makes it more resilient, more sustainable, and but I think there's no one single factor, and I think just coming back to the social aspect as well, and the people, that farming and farmers are very entrepreneurial in spirit, that they're dealing with the realities of climate change. They understand it. They're dealing with droughts and floods, etc., changing conditions all the times, and the impact that can have on their businesses. And I suppose it's about recognizing this, and then recognizing that they also want to play a role in, I suppose, taking forward some of these initiatives. But that while we can take broad principles from a European perspective, I think we need to have autonomy at national and definitely at farm level, to recognise that there's no one size fits all. Here in Ireland, particularly, we have a kind of a slogan or phrase, that it's the right measure in the right place at the right time. And I think that is critical, that we reflect the diversity of farm businesses, and that farmers who know their land and know their businesses really well, and also, to recognise that generational knowledge that is there, on farms, that we understand the history of the land too, and to bring all of that forward and to place a value on that, I think is really important, and that, to maintain choice at farm level. Because I suppose one thing that struck me when we compare the Danish model to the Irish model is the comments I think Erik mentioned, that smaller farms are not included in this emissions tax at the moment. And my understanding, but maybe Erik or Johannes could correct me, is that here in Ireland, I think the average size of farm, according to 23 figures in the Irish Farm Survey, is about just sort of shy of 35 hectares. But it's double that. It's 70 to 80 in Denmark is the average size farm. So I think we need to look at the complexities that fabric may bring, but also the opportunities. And so, like the model that we've taken here, the approach, that the framework that we have at the moment, is that we have measures, targeted measures that farmers are doing. We have sustainability, a digital sustainability platform. We have education and awareness, really good support in respect to that, and looking at bringing down production efficiencies and coming at it from efficiencies rather and targeted measures, rather than looking at excess per se. And I think those messages were coming through in the presentations this morning as well, that taxes are not going to solve the problem, that we need active measures, and we need to recognise the scale. And again, just coming back, that you have to recognise the capacity of a farmer to invest, that they're responding to markets and responding to structural policy changes. So we need to all take kind of co-responsibility in this. Like, there's a role of consumers, there's a role in terms of the wider kind of holistic approach here, to step back and think about the bioeconomy, think about energy, and the different value-added elements of farming as well. And I suppose just to conclude, I suppose one of the thoughts that I had listening to the presentations this morning was that we're very much at the start of this journey, and the key thing for me is, as we move through this, is that and what I'll be looking to learn from is how do we keep everybody on the journey? How do we ensure this kind of cooperation as we move forward? And to look at the key challenge is going to be in implementation and the monitoring of this going forward, and to keep that momentum. So I might leave it there, but happy to take any questions that you may have and come back in again. Thanks, Niamh.
Great, thank you, Maria. And I'll invite all of the panelists maybe to rejoin the screens here, and we can open up for a little bit of discussion. I'm just going to put a couple of questions to the panelists first, and then I see we have a good few questions coming in on the Q&A. So thank you to the participants, and keep those coming in. But firstly, maybe to Johannes, the agreement, as you articulated, brings together multiple objectives: biodiversity, water quality, climate, land use in one package, which, as Maria just reflected, maybe this is something of a strength. Maybe you could talk a little bit about, I suppose, some of the governance mechanisms that ensure that these different objectives were balanced, you know, that there is no sort of vetoing of different priorities.
Yeah, I think that was quite a big concern also here after the announcement of the tripartite, that the different ministries will interfere with each other because of the different priorities, and this agreement bringing so many things together. And I think the government came up with a very simple solution. They just created a new ministry. It's called the Ministry for the Green Tripartite. And they are taking over the responsibilities regarding to this agreement, with the idea that the Agriculture Ministry, the environmental agencies, and the Climate Ministry won't interfere with each other, but this was centralized at this new ministry, while the other ministries have other roles. For example, the Climate Ministry has the role of going out into the EU and pushing for this agenda that I've talked about. But yeah, it's quite a simple solution to this complex governance issue.
Thank you. And maybe for Erik, you discussed how the agreement was built, bringing, I suppose, the different stakeholders together: agriculture, industry, unions, municipalities, NGOs at the same table. I suppose one question, what sort of design element or, you know, early concession maybe unlocked that sort of acceptance from particularly the farmer side in relation to land conversion and the CO2 tax, the carbon tax? I mean, you also mentioned tax maybe was not your first or even second choice. You might say a little bit as well of maybe some of your, you know, alternative preferences as well. Thank you.
Yeah, first and foremost, I would say that what was key for us, I think, what was the icebreaker, not a deal breaker, but icebreaker, was that we had a clear framework. Everybody was invited, so to speak. All important stakeholders were invited, but we were working under a clear framework of not a rule setting, but everybody need to compromise. We couldn't just bring forward our wishing list and say we want it all or nothing. So we all had to accept, for instance, in our case, a carbon tax was unavoidable. We didn't want it, but that's how it is. So we needed to accept that. The same goes for the Green parties and so on. They needed to accept that, for instance, we will have a large export-oriented agriculture in the future. That's not the dream scenario for a green organization, but they needed to accept that. So that's very important that you had these predefined borders. And yeah, as I mentioned, the tax itself was not our invention, not at all. I think we could reach the same by doing it in a bit different way. But a lot of the important elements are included in the agreement. For instance, investment aid for change in land use, for technologies, for practices in cultivation. I didn't mention that in my presentation, but this is not all about technologies. It's about, you could say, carbon farming as well. We got two expert groups into the agreement as well, and they looked into what about regenerative agriculture, can that help, and so on. So different ways of cultivating is important as well. It's not all about steel and tanks. So yeah.
Thank you. And maybe Maria, from, I suppose, your perspective, speaking from the young farmer perspective and maybe the family farm perspective that you mentioned as well, I mean, what would you say maybe are some of the earlier those visible signals that could work to build trust rather than maybe anxiety in such a process if it was to happen in Ireland? For example, subsidies or rethinking advisory supports or tenure mechanisms or other kinds of things that you might point to for that sort of trust building perspective.
Yeah, I think it's, it really comes back to that common ground of, to start from that place and that everybody is at the table. And really for me, it's around, and we see this happening already, in different environmental spaces, different partners coming together across different backgrounds, from industry to research to farming communities, to try and look at this together. And I think it's about, everybody at the table, everybody actively listening, and particularly from a young farmer point of view, because we are the minority, is really beginning to kind of listen in a real way to what the barriers are and how we can overcome them together, and how we can have more integrated policy, that looking at environmental without looking at social, without having farmers there. We need everything moving forward together. And I think it just starts with those initial conversations and that active listening piece, and in a willingness, I suppose, to find the solutions together, because they're not always easy to find, and there is a compromise from all sides that will need to be found as we come, because we have very big challenges, not just in the environment, but in the financial and the viability of farms, and then also in terms of the social element and the generation renewal aspect.
Thank you. And Ailbhe, for yourself, so Denmark is investing 134 million in plant-based food and organic farming. If Ireland was, adopting a deal for diversified or organic producers, would you identify, or would you see a risk of any, I suppose, unpriced co-benefits, whether to soil or water or resilience, that could be at risk if they were ignored? I suppose are there some sort of, credible pathways that you'd point to for those sort of valuing ecosystem services that you'd like to speak to?
That's a great question. Thank you. Yes, Denmark is investing heavily in plant-based food and in organic farming. And if Ireland went down the same pathway, I think that there would be, to be honest, absolutely no risk to unpriced co-benefits, things like water quality, soil, biodiversity, because organic farming and regenerative agriculture, by their very nature, have, is well proven, have positive impacts on water quality, because you're not using artificial fertilizers, for instance. Biodiversity tends to be better on organic farms, etc., etc. And quite apart from that, it would also give a better balance of payments for Ireland, because we're importing such large amounts of artificial fertilizer. It would immediately make a difference to our emissions if a magic wand was waved and Ireland moved towards organic farming. I mean, obviously that's not going to happen just like that, but no, those co-benefits, those public goods, would not be affected if Ireland took on this kind of approach and system.
Great, thank you. Well, we've plenty of questions coming in, so I'll take a few from the audience. So online, Myra Dowling asked, how much are the tax raising measures expected to raise vis-a-vis the fund that Johannes noted in his presentation? And a second question, these are both to Johannes and Erik. Geraldine O'Sullivan from the Irish Farmers Association also asked, that Johannes mentioned the climate action will lead to a 4% reduction in production. And maybe you could say a little bit more on the cost, so unpacking the cost to the farmer in undertaking the measures. And I suppose whether these costs would be fully covered by the tax generated or the Green Land Fund, and maybe what sort of analysis has been done on the real cost to farmers and the impact on farm income. So I think primarily to Johannes, but Erik also, if you can come on. Thank you.
Yes, I think both are very good questions. I think the first question is a bit difficult to answer at this point, because we have these base deductions, and there are still ongoing discussions on what technologies we should be taking in there, and that will then determine how much take-up there will be and how many technologies will be implemented, and how, in the end, how much tax will be paid or not avoided by implementing better technologies. So it's quite difficult to say right now how much the tax will actually raise. But that's something I think is super interesting to follow, and of course important for how much money is going back into the agricultural sector. But yeah, can't answer this right now. Maybe Erik has something more to that. I'll just take the second question. Also, very good and valid question. That has actually been explored in quite a lot of depth in this expert group report that came out before the tripartite started negotiating, where they have laid out what technologies are available and what they will cost, and that basically can say, okay, farmers can abate so and so much by implementing these technologies, avoiding paying the tax, and that's basically the cost. The potential costs. Don't have a specific number in my head right now, but the calculations have been done, and the expected costs are less than the tax, because otherwise farmers would just more or less decide to pay the tax instead. So you can assume that the average cost per farm is going to be less than 100 euros per ton. Here, yeah, Erik, maybe you have something to add.
I can add a bit, but I don't have all the answers. Nobody has, as Johannes mentioned. It's an ongoing process deciding this the tax system and looking into which measures can be implemented. From our perspective, hopefully for us, of course, there will be very low revenues and a low recycling of money, because we really want to invest to reduce the emissions, but for doing that, we need a lot of measures, not only technologies, farming practices as well. We need more knowledge, and to doing so, we need them coming in. And until now, it has been quite difficult to know what to do if you have a potential technology, potential measure. What do I do then? It's not a very clear path for approval. So hopefully we can make a fast track approval system. That's part of the agreement. And secondly, there's a climate measure committee, I think you can call it, working right now with the members from all organizations, the tripartite organizations run by the government, of course, and they are looking into whatever measures are on the shelves or coming up, and how should they be processed forward in order to have a wide variety of technologies, because not two farms are alike, so we need a lot of different solutions. Some want to have steel and tanks, others want to do some carbon farming, so we need to cover it all, and hopefully we can have a lot of solutions, very cheap ones, so we don't need subsidies, so the farmers, they can implement with only low extra costs, yeah, and we'll have a low revenue. That's basically it.
Thank you. Another couple of questions here. So Matt O'Neill, Climate Project Lead with the IIEA, would like the panel maybe to talk about their experience of the Danish model, and specifically, I suppose, how Ireland or other EU member states could build similar cross-sectoral partnerships, and perhaps also expand a little bit on EU level ambitions, such as those touched on in the presentation. And then Paul Price has asked about deep and sustained cuts in annual methane emissions. So noting that they are crucial for the fair share to meet the 1.5 degrees target. He notes that the IPCC pathways indicate global average 40% cuts by 2040. And the question, I suppose, then is, does the agreement ensure that agricultural methane mitigation is a specific priority? And that's to Johannes and Erik to balance as you.
All right. Yeah, thank you. To the methane question, totally agree. It's super important to decrease methane rapidly because it is the cheapest and the fastest way to halt climate change. And I think the research is very clear on that. And I think there is a big focus on methane emissions in this agreement. That's why the big tax is on livestock. And that's here to reduce mostly methane emissions. So I think there's a good focus on methane here, but that's definitely something. On the other question on EU strategies, well, there is the EU Commission looking into different policy options, and there has been quite mixed positions from the different member states. There are, of course, some member states in the EU that categorically are against any climate action in the agricultural sector. I'm not going to throw in names, but I think there's some usual suspects. But then there are other member states that are very much open for regulation, and member states that have reached out to Erik's organization and to my organization and to the government to hear more about this agreement. And that's also definitely something that Erik and I are doing. We want to go out and talk about this agreement because we think it's a big milestone, and it's something that can be a model for a European case. So, yeah.
I might just add a few words to what Johannes said. I totally agree about the focus on methane, the need for an EU path as well. And I can just tell insight from agriculture in the EU. I know we have some of our Irish friends there. They are joining this webinar, so they can probably totally agree. But there's a general concern, almost a fear amongst most farmers unions from other member states about climate and agriculture, because there's a lot of fear that this will cost money, this will cost production, and so on. So what is really needed is, in my perspective, is an EU system that builds on some of the same pillars as the Danish system, with full collaboration, accepting that we need agriculture in the future, building on incentives and so on. As I said, a tax, and Johannes mentioned it as well, a tax will never be the case on EU level, because not all countries will agree on that. So you need to build another system, and we are not in favor of the tax ourselves, so we can't recommend it. But we could surely build a system that brings incentives and perhaps extra income for some farmers by doing, I wouldn't call it carbon farming, because the carbon farming itself, by doing changes in cultivation, might not bring a lot of reductions, but doing things on farms that you get paid for, but by doing in a positive way, that would be the way forward. And I agree with Johannes on, we are looking very much into some EU solutions, some EU climate architecture for agriculture, because that's the only way forward. What we're doing in Denmark is good for Denmark, and we can be perhaps a role model, or the opposite, I don't know, but it won't change we won't reach the 1.5 target by doing stuff in Denmark. We need to expand it. We need to do it in all around the world, but initially in EU, I think. And we need to start now. We don't. We have the base deduction system in Denmark, so we don't need to fear that we have to close down agriculture, close down production. We can build a fair system. I think we have a fair system in Denmark, even though the tax is not the best, but that's the way it is.
Thank you. Lots of questions coming in. So Sean Kelly, a dairy farmer, has picked up maybe on Maria's point also on this. A question to Erik on that smaller farmers wouldn't be affected by the new carbon tax in Denmark, and maybe could you say a little bit more on the definition of smaller farms in the Danish context? And then there's a question from Barry Colfer, Director of Research at the IIEA, and this question is for everyone on the panel, so I'll invite everyone to come in on this. So building on Maria's point, could the panel reflect on how might cooperation on things like innovation funding, investment, advisory services, or even broader rural investment help to create a stronger European common ground for a fair transition in farming? And maybe specifically to Erik and Johannes or any of the panel, are there other examples that we're aware of that we could look at? So to Erik first, just on the specific question, you might give your response to the second question as well, and then we'll go back to the other.
Yeah, I'll start with the first question. I didn't get all the second part because I was already preparing the first, but perhaps somebody else can start on that and I can join in. But on the first question regarding the size of farms, what is the threshold and so on, it's not defined yet. So we don't know actually yet. But I can be a bit more specific on organic farming. That could be interesting regarding I think it was an organic farmer. So it could be a bit interesting to talk about how is organic farming dealt with? The situation for organic farmers are that they don't have the same amount of tools, because I mean they have restrictions on the use of fertilizer, some technological issues as well. So they have a smaller toolbox, so to speak. So they could be hit even harder than conventional farmers, because the targets will be the same. I mean, 1 ton of CO2 is 1 ton of CO2, regardless of it's being conventional or organic. So there's it's written into the agreement that a solution must be found for the organic farmers, so the organic production will not drop, because they could be hit harder than conventional. So a solution does not exist yet, but the concerns are they are looked at, they are addressed in the agreement. So, but there are no thresholds yet. There are no final solution for organic farmers yet. But it is going to be before the tax is introduced in 5 years' time. We will have a solution.
And then open to the wider panel, and you might come back in then, Erik, if you have reflections on this, but on the role of things such as innovation funding, investment, advisory services, broader rural investment in supporting a fair transition, and any examples that you'd draw out. I don't know if Ailbhe or Maria would like to come in first before I open up to Johannes. Yeah.
Hi, yes, that would be, thank you very much. Yeah, I think that one of the things I've pointed out already about Denmark is that there is a huge willingness to collaborate and to understand that there has to be compromise. And in the Irish context, that we don't have quite the same focus on solving the climate emissions biodiversity problem, because we're a market-driven agriculture sector. So what I think, in order to make this work, I think what there needs to be is work with people who are working in advisory, work with Teagasc, and to ensure, like the Danish context, is that there is a holistic understanding of what the problem is. What we are missing is the leadership to bring the parties together. It's actually a brilliant idea, Johannes, to set up a ministry for the tripartite agreement. That actually would help solve quite a few of the problems in the Irish context. But there's no point in having money to start laying out to solve the problem until we've agreed what the issues are and how we're all pulling together on that. But we do have, it is still a huge opportunity to work together, because right now what's working, Irish farming is not working so well for Irish farmers, particularly the smaller ones. And I'm really concerned, so at Talamh, we're really concerned that we look after livelihoods, and it's not just about amount of production of food, it's about, can we support the livelihoods, so you can actually have just as good a livelihood with less inputs, and changing the system of farming, and this could help with that.
And Maria or Johannes on the role of innovation funding and investment.
Yeah, I can come in. Yeah, so I guess this is framed in the concept of a just transition, and that we need a movement. But I would say that that farmers and farm businesses are changing all the time, and they're responding to different policies. And I think that we need support. Of course, that we need support in terms of innovation and research. I mean, that is critical. But I mean, it's how we move forward. So like within the tripartite agreement, we have elements such as the organic ambition. We also have the plant-based ambition. Then we also have different technologies that are there, such as the biochar. I think the issues are, as we move forward, that when to take ideas from the innovation research into practice, and I think that's the biggest challenge, and to be able to do that in a timely manner that manages our other ambitions. I mean, it's very difficult to ask farmers to invest in technologies that we're not sure the full extent or any unintended consequences that there may or may not be. And until all of this is worked out, you know, it's very hard to look at that investment piece on the ground and how we might support that. So I do think, you know, that there's a huge role for innovation and research, of course, but it's how we get from that stage into practice on the ground, and then the next stage to be able to support investment, particularly within our model where we are a family farm base system, an outdoor system, and to recognise that and to bring that forward and not to lose, you know, what makes us unique as well in terms of our agricultural model. And, you know, I suppose I would just add, you know, farmers are adapting and changing all the time, and, you know, we do want to protect livelihoods, as Ailbhe said. That's really important, because if you're not viable, well then you're not going to have, you know, there's not opportunities there and growth. It's very hard to ask anybody to come in. And I suppose, like, I think farmers in particular are very aware of, you know, the whole climate space and, you know, the targets, but also the implications of climate change on the ground. And I suppose adapting to climate change and integrating mitigation measures is already ongoing, you know, and it's a necessary part of your business model to be able to manage and your management strategy, really. So I think it's really just having the supports, you know, there to have those strong measures and support tools to be able to make, you know, innovation and research is really helpful because it gives you data to make informed decisions, to look at cost efficiencies, to, you know, to be able to put the right measure in the right place, and to make those important, I suppose, because decisions around efficiencies, because our system is very much in our supports in terms of climate is looking at production efficiencies. And I think that's where technology is really, really important in having good and up-to-date data as well. And I suppose that helps then farmers to adapt, to protect the environment, but also adapt to, because we're living through this, you know, day on day. As we work towards the goals, we're also living through it. And so it's important that we not only have those measures that help us to protect and reduce emissions, but also to be able to adapt day on day. And that requires, you know, that knowledge base and also the financial support to be able to make these big changes that are needed in some cases. Some cases they're smaller, some cases they're bigger, but it's just to be able to make that investment, and in particular in terms of capital investment, to, you know, have that value added on your farm, in terms of an investment into sustainability going forward as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. I'm conscious of the time. I will just, there's another question in here for the Danish participants. We won't get to all of the questions, I'm afraid, but Charles O'Donnell from Agriland Media has asked our Danish panelists if there's been any research or work done to examine how the tax will impact on the number of farmers actively farming, and whether, I suppose, there have been any concerns raised in Denmark that taxation on production might see farmers with lower profit margins deciding to exit out of farming or retire. And Rory O'Donnell has also an interest, I guess, in the role of the 23 regional tripartite councils, and to what extent, I guess, the tax was a prompt for engagement in collective problem solving. And we might take the answers to these from Johannes and Erik, and then we'll do a very quick wrap up just to hear from each of the panelists to finish after that. Thank you.
Good question again. I think that's also something that the expert group report has looked into quite a lot, and it was definitely a goal of the negotiators to come up with an agreement that will not lead to farmers and exit production. I don't have, again, a number in my mind. I know that there have been some concerns, but I don't think that is something that's has been, a big problem in the aftermath of the negotiations. But maybe Erik has more to that.
The only thing I can add is that in general we have a very fast structural development in the Danish agriculture, meaning that the number of farmers is dropping because the farms are getting bigger and bigger. It happens all over Europe, but we have been in forefront on that for many years. So this will play into that, I guess. But it's very hard to divide, I think. And at the end, it all ends up to if we can make the solution cheap with a lot of different measures, it might not have any impact, or if it turns out that we don't have any solutions and we have to pay a lot of tax, it might be a problem. But I guess that's part of the agreement to look into this if and try to adjust on its way, because the target, as Johannes mentioned, is not to have a cut in production and a cut in farmers. So there will be changes, of course, if you reduce the arable land by 15% or so. I guess it will take out some jobs from agriculture, but perhaps put it into other sectors like forestry and so on.
Great. And briefly on the role of the different tripartite councils, or the regional councils.
So the 23 regional councils, their role is mostly to decide about the renaturalization and the 5 billion euro fund here. So where land is taken out, where are we are we investing into nitrogen reducing efforts? So it's mostly about that. There's not a lot about the text the regional tripartites are negotiating.
Great. As we enter the last few minutes of the panel, and there are so many questions, my apologies we didn't get to all of them, I might just ask each of the panelists just very briefly, I guess, on your closing thoughts, maybe on what inspiration maybe Ireland could take from this. We'll start with Maria, then Ailbhe, Johannes, then Erik. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you. Yes, I suppose the key thing for me is the opportunity here to bring generation renewal through and to look at that social element of sustainability alongside and match that in our ambition for environment and while protecting the financial viability of farms so that they have that ability to invest. And I think, you know, there is lots of opportunities here, and one key thing that strikes me is around the diversification element and looking at the value added of farming produce and farming output. And I think that is very welcome going forward, that we have a very kind of dynamic farm model and that we're looking at the circularity of production going forward as well, and the responsibility not just of the farmers but all of society and the role that we all have to play in that. But critically, the role of structural policy. I know we don't have time to go into that today, but you know, those other key drivers that we need in terms of achieving these goals. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. And maybe very briefly, Ailbhe, we just the last couple of minutes, we'll take a minute each.
Great. Just to wrap up, I think the inspiration is that the Danish agricultural model is quite similar to the Irish in being an export-driven, largely meat and milk type of agriculture. But it looks at it's a much fairer polluter pays kind of model by taxing excess emissions, but also providing incentives to support farmers through the transition. And in the Irish context, in order for us to ensure food and fodder security, we need to diversify our agricultural production. And the Danish way gives us, Danish tripartite model gives us an opportunity to see how to do this. So thanks guys for going first, promoting horticulture and tillage for greater food sovereignty. And our nature restoration is part of that. It's complementary to that aim as well as looking after our sector in agriculture and farmers. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And so Johannes and Erik, maybe one key thing you think Ireland can learn from your experience.
Yes, I think it's great that there has been such a big interest in this event, and tells me how far Irish agriculture is already in thinking in this way. And I think what's very important is that Denmark is maybe just a small step ahead in thinking about this. Ireland you will run into the same issue. Emissions from agriculture will eventually be the largest emission sector, and it will undermine your ability to reach climate targets. So it's very important to act first. It will just make it a lot cheaper and easier to do so. And that we do so much about our environment, about reforestation is also about climate adaptation. And in order to ensure that we will have a functioning agriculture sector also in the future. And I think that's something that cannot be done too early. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Erik, for the very last minute.
Thank you. I'll keep it short. I believe that farmers, they are alike. I mean, an Irish farmer is very similar to a Danish farmer, even though we do different stuff, perhaps. I would say collaboration and inclusion is vital, and it still is. But after this discussion and hearing all the input from our panelists from Ireland, I would say that a long-term holistic approach, I mean, that's very important to farmers. They are willing to do anything. They are very come up with good ideas, but they need to have a clear roadmap. And if they have that, they will reach the target. So a roadmap for the future.
Well, on that very positive note, thank you very much. Thank you to all the panelists. I think you've led us in a really rich reflection, and thank you all to the participants online for all the really engaging questions, and hopefully the conversation can continue into the future. Thank you, everyone.